Cardinal Lawrence is tasked with one of the world's most secretive and ancient events, participating in the selection of a new pope. Surrounded by powerful religious leaders in the halls of the Vatican, he soon uncovers a trail of deep secrets that could shake the very foundation of the Roman Catholic Church. Conclave is directed by Edward Berger and stars Ralph Fiennes, Isabella Rossellini, Stanley Tucci, and many more. So Jeffrey, what did you think about Conclave?
Conclave comes to us from Edward Berger, who's a German director. His breakout film was All Quiet on the Western Front that we reviewed a couple of years ago. That was a very, very technically impressive film. It ended up winning a bunch of below-the-line Oscars, and I think did a tremendous job of adapting very, very bleak subject matter in the same type of bleak way that I would expect from that type of filmmaking. Conclave is a bit of a departure from that, and certainly not the massive production or spectacle that that film was, but I think continues to show Berger as a rigid technician behind the camera, and very admirably so. It certainly helps that this film takes place in Rome, and the set mirrors a lot of the lavish marble hallways and staircases you see when you visit Rome. It's an interesting film because it's essentially a thriller, and I don't know if Agatha Christie ever wrote a political thriller, but it almost has this quality of searching for a pope and who it's going to be. Feels like you're trying to find out the killer of a mystery novel. It has that suspenseful quality. It's shot like a thriller. Like there are these really tense close-ups. I remember one early on in the film when the pope dies, they have this close-up of the wheel of his stretcher going on the floor. Like in the beginning, there's a lot of close-ups on actors' faces, and it's just really good at building tension. It's pretty effective with that tension throughout the film. It does take itself rather seriously. Like the score is very foreboding and classically taught, but there's almost like this popcorn flick quality to the events that you can't take it too seriously, even though it's taking itself seriously. Like it has the aura of prestige, and it always prioritizes entertainment. So like that seriousness is not taken too seriously. It's odd. I don't know if I'm describing that.
No, I completely agree. I was thinking it has this weird blend of these daytime soapy TV moments with the serious weight of the Vatican.
Yeah, like I don't want to call it this because so many people have used this word already, but a lot of people have called it pulpy, and it is pulpy. It honestly reminded me of like a better than average airport novel, but overall I liked it. I thought it was maybe a little bit minor, but it was really effective and engrossing.
I completely agree. I think what makes this film so interesting is this battle between the cardinals vying for the role of the next pope. We are exposed to this really modern view of the church, its diversity both in people and ideas. As these cardinals get together, these groups are formed based on race, geographical location, and political views. In a way, it seems eerily similar to our own country's divides and conversations. You have this traditional Italian cardinal played by Sergio Castellitto who wants to turn back the clock to a time where the church was more conservative. And then you have this progressive cardinal played by the wonderful Stanley Tucci who will not really compromise on his liberal beliefs, regardless of whether it costs him votes and thus the progress he so desperately wants to see. While there are some other players in that as well, they are all tied together by our main character, Thomas, played by the lovely Ralph Fiennes, who has been tasked by the late Pope to run this conclave. It's in that task that he's really exploring his faith in the church as an institution while shaping this process, considering the modern setting and how it butts up against these traditional processes.
Yeah, the film sets up this dialogue of opposing ideas. So it's basically about tradition versus progressivism. And the framework is vague enough that it can be applied to almost anything, like you were saying, politics, work, family. There's always a side that's looking to harken back to a more rigid traditional philosophy, and those that are looking to take conventional ideals and push them forward into the future. Here we have Tucci and Fiennes' character recognizing the growing irrelevance of the church, and that butting up against the more old-fashioned era of the Catholicism that you were talking about. The film gives us a lot of fiery speeches of like great moral fervor. Though the writing of the speeches isn't bad per se, they are very, very on the nose. The film makes it very clear that we're supposed to side with the progressive side, and those morals couldn't be more clear anytime Tucci or Ralph Fiennes speaks. Some of their statements feel like damn close to a mic drop, you know, especially like when Ralph Fiennes is giving his little keynote address thing. I forgot what it's called. But anyway, as exciting as that is from a propulsive plot perspective, it's rather thin from a thematic perspective. The film is not so much interrogating the nuances here as much as it is like almost employing the tenets of a sports movie. We hope that the progressive side wins and the traditional side loses, but all the more so, like, it's entertaining, you know, as we were saying. Like, it's not a film that I'm thinking very deeply about, but it is a film that I very much enjoyed while I was watching it.
I do want to push back on that idea a little bit because I think the character of Cardinal Benitez, played by Carlos Diaz in this movie, is this middle ground between both of these sides. And I think that's one of the big messages of the film, which I don't want to get too deep into. Their character plays a role in, I think, tying the past and the future progressivism together in a way that is a reminder of the intention of the church and how that's being lost in the film through all the other cardinals. That's one of the things I would push back a little bit on.
I think maybe that the film's ideas seem more complex than they are because it's within the confines of the Catholic Church. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, that the Catholic Church is known for traditions and being very, very old-fashioned in all these ways. Like, we have this Pope now who's a little more accepting of things. I mean, it could be better.
I don't know which way the wind goes every statement or something like
listen,
that.
It could be better, but he has said some things that are more progressive than any other Pope. Let's put it that way. So anyway, I think that this is actually going on within the church, and I think that they're looking to survive and make their way into like another century in their thinking, while also adhering to what the Bible says. And you very admirably and somewhat complimentary said that this reminds you a lot of my Instagram, because one of the things that I'm very concerned with is I'm not a religious person, but I like looking at the Bible as text and what it's actually saying and what that translates to as far as like modern Christian nationalism. And I think that modern Christian nationalism is so divorced from what the Bible is saying that it's crazy. So I think this film is actually engaging with what the Bible is actually saying, or like what is the role of being a Christian, much more so than many films I see. So I like that perspective, and we don't see that perspective a lot in film, honestly.
Yeah, I completely agree. The role you play on your Instagram is certainly that of Cardinal Benitez in this film. So I want to go back to a little bit of what I was saying earlier, talking about this modern setting that the film is taking place in. This also extends itself to the technology and how technology plays a role in this story. There are scenes featuring cardinals that are sitting on their cell phones before the conclave starts. There are nuns using computers. This picture is just so odd to me because I never really pictured these people using these technological advances, but not just for the practical role that they play in the film and the story. These visualizations, I think, added to this idea that these people are really not so different from ourselves. I think that's important because as someone who grew up in the Roman Catholic Church, I think regrettably, people within the church typically receive an initial impression of moral superiority just because of their title. I think we often feel separated, or even worse so, beneath these people because their lives and their process is purposefully made elusive to us. This film in some ways is a reminder that these are just regular men who are just as flawed as the rest of humanity. And that's one of the things I really appreciated about the film.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that's a very admirable thing. So some of the ideas here that, in my opinion, are like lacking in complexity necessitate strong acting because, frankly, all of it would sound so hokey and pedantic without a really great cast. I'm happy to say that the times I doubted the writing, I never doubted the cast. Stanley Tucci, in particular, I think is incredible here. Like, I really hope he gets an Oscar nomination. We have to count how many times I say I hope somebody gets an Oscar nomination, and then maybe it's like 12 people in the supporting category. Anyway, it's a performance that needs to garner audience support. Otherwise, you'll be able to see some of the film's seams, I think. But Tucci delivers his lines with such fervor and such concentration. It's really terrific. Ralph Fiennes is a bit more subdued, but just as good. He's a more doubtful, resolute dean who's clearly trying to navigate sparring egos and all of these contrary philosophies, and doing so fairly, I think, between all of the sides.
I completely agree. I do think there's a depthness to these characters that I would like to talk about. In particular, we could start with Stanley Tucci's character because he is drawing this line between his liberalism and progressivism and the reality of how many votes he can get. As the film progresses, he sort of gets lost in this. As I would say, he gets more ambitious, but also more frustrated with the lack of votes coming his way, almost as if he does eventually want to be the role of Pope, even though he keeps saying and reiterating that he doesn't want it unless people vote for him. So it's not like he's striving to it, but there's a sense of striving as the film progresses. And this culminates in a scene where he acts in a way that's sort of beneath him and his character and the values he espouses. That realization, I thought, is a really wonderful moment in the film because it brings him back down to ground level.
I agree, actually. I hadn't quite thought of that, how that works in terms of building his character and the transformation that he has from beginning to end, rather than how that fits into the plot and like the whodunit and who's going to be the Pope type of thing. That's a very good point. That's actually good screenwriting that both of those work at the same time.
Yeah, and then going from there into Ralph Fiennes' character, he is having this moral struggle with the structure of the church, and he is dealing with a crisis of faith, not with his belief in God, but his belief in the church. I really like seeing the progress of this conundrum as it played throughout the movie. He is overwhelmed with grief at the beginning. He wanted to resign ordain, and the Pope would not let him. I really liked how this crisis of faith was dealt with by his experience dealing with Cardinal Benitez. He learned something from him that I think he gained towards the end of the movie. That'll be more of a spoiler section, but I will talk more about that particular aspect of his character then.
I like how the film treats a crisis of faith as more of him having an issue of this manifestation of faith rather than his faith in God. I think he very much believes in God the whole time. It's just a matter of how does he honor God? Is he doing it correctly with all of these traditions of the Catholic Church, or is breaking away and having a small order somewhere really what God intended? That idea being somewhat unanswered is some of the nuances and more interesting parts of religion. And I think that echoes this theme of the film that the film believes, and this is very correct, and I think, frankly, a lot of religious people get this wrong, is that doubt and faith are intertwined with one another, and you cannot have one without the other. I remember there was this big news story like 10 or 15 years ago that there was evidence in Mother Teresa's diaries that she had doubts. Like, that's part of the whole thing. And I say this as a person who is not religious, but like, doubt is essential to what religiosity is. So I like that the film so clearly deals with that idea instead of just saying, oh, you're having doubts. Well, no, that's just a momentary lapse. You're actually having faith. That's not interesting, and that's not true. Like, doubt is part of your religious experience.
I remember there's a scene in the film, I'm struggling to remember when, and we just saw this yesterday, but I'm struggling to remember when, but there's a reflection specifically on that.
Yeah, that's what I'm referring to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So there's a wonderful scene about that in the film. Going from there, I want to get into more spoilery aspects of the film and talk about the ending and some things that lead up to it. So if you have not seen Conclave, feel free to come back to this review if you would like to. Otherwise, you're about to be spoiled. We were just on the subject of Ralph Fiennes' character, and there is this moral conundrum. We were talking about the processes of the church and the old processes melding with the new technology and things like that. So we have cell phones now, we have computers, and there's these little things that are starting to come to light. We haven't talked about Isabella Rossellini's character, but she plays Sister Agnes. I would say the head nun. She's in control of all the nuns during this conclave. She is helping Ralph Fiennes' character get this information on her computer. It's a really great scene.
She's magnificent, by the way.
Yeah.
She's not in the film very much, but every scene she has is like stunning.
And there's this particular scene where this information is revealed. It's put on all the table settings in the cafeteria. John Lithgow's character is trying to defend himself, and everybody is almost starting to fall for his excuses. But then Sister Agnes comes right in, and she literally sets everybody straight.
Yeah.
She says the most magnificent little monologue, and it turns the whole thing upside down. Do we want to get to the biggest spoiler of them all?
Do you want to describe what happens? You're better at that.
I could describe
and then I could talk about what I think.
So in the end, as Cardinal Benitez is about to assume his new role as Pope, he confesses to Thomas that he is in fact intersex and has sex characteristics that are both male and female. Besides Thomas's acknowledgement and understanding and the role that has in the film's ending, I also see this reveal as almost a little litmus test for the audience itself. I don't know if you took it the same way. In my mind, the questions I'm asking an audience member are, how did this revelation make you feel? Do you think this person is still worthy of the role of Pope? Do you think they should have shared this information with all the other cardinals beforehand? In the end, this film is really meant to be a reminder of what the true purpose and nature of the church should be. And I think with that in mind, anybody should honestly say that they're okay with this. But I think the litmus test is in the people that do not think this is okay.
This was on Reddit, so it wasn't like anything published film criticism or anything. But I saw an interesting thing that someone suggested that it would have been more effective if Ralph Fiennes' character knew about this before he voted, so that it wouldn't have been a moral conundrum. It would have been like a moral statement. And I actually disagree with that. I like
disagree.
it.
Yeah.
I like it better the other way. And the reason is because by electing someone who presumably has both male and female sex organs, the twist can be seen as tacked on or sudden. But I do really like what it has to say philosophically. And it's like this idea that the arcane restrictions of Catholicism are rooted in folly, not in pragmatism. So these guys elected someone who's technically not eligible to be Pope without even knowing it. What makes the strict rules of Catholicism seem more petty than that? So I can understand how it may seem sudden from a dramatic perspective, but from a thematic perspective, I think it's really interesting and really cool.
I completely agree. I think the movie does a wonderful job showing how throughout this process, Cardinal Benitez is the only character that's really espousing the traits and the teachings of Jesus. Think about it. They never make a point to ask anybody for their votes. They sit silently, they observe, they don't try to do any backdoor dealings. All they do is sit there and say the teachings of Jesus out loud. They don't put personal beliefs into it. They don't put opinions into it. They don't fight between sides. And it's in that practice in which everybody finds respect and understanding in that. Obviously, that person is just the best person to assume the role. And that's why they do so almost instantly after that monologue that they have in the last meeting.
Yeah, and I can't remember who says it, but somebody who wants to be pope disqualifies themselves from being pope, essentially. It's if you think you're unworthy of being pope, then you're most likely to be the best pope that there is.
Yeah.
I had an old woman sitting next to me, and maybe this is a lovely person in real life and just not a good movie theater goer. First thing is she packed a tuna fish sandwich, and she ate it next to me slowly. And I could smell it. It was stank. It was not good. She was on her phone, and many of us who have grandparents know that your grandparents can't see their phones. So the brightness is all the way up. And it's like, one letter is on the screen. That's how zoomed in it is. And then her friend starts slapping her hand like, "What are you doing? Get your phone away, blah, blah, blah." So anyway, that's happening. After this whole thing with the new pope happens at the end of the movie, it ends and it's just like Conclave, directed by Edward Berger. And she says very loudly, Jamie Lee Curtis was also a hermaphrodite. I did not have fun with this theater goer. Again, I'm sure that she's a lovely woman. Actually, I could spin this in a positive way. If they're getting just a dose of progressive ideas from this film in a way that makes sense to them in like a tightly wound thriller, I think that's great.
Anyways, there's one other little flourish that I want to talk about in the film that is slightly in spoiler territory, I guess you could say. But I want to talk about the turtles. Ralph Fiennes is explaining at one point how the turtles were brought in by the late Pope and how since his passing, they don't really know what to do with them. And so they're just roaming around. They keep getting run over by vehicles, etc. At the end of the film, Thomas is walking through the courtyard and he sees one of the turtles scurrying along. And so he picks up the turtle and he brings it to the little fountain area and puts it in the water. I thought this was a testament to the little thoughtful actions that somebody can make, this small consideration of life that needs to be remembered. And I think that was a little metaphor for the entirety of the film.
Yeah, I like that. I actually had a completely different interpretation, which is that if the prior pope was this force of progressivism and this force of going against tradition within the church, it's like his turtles continually escaping and going throughout the Vatican is like him living on in a way. It's like his little effect that he had on the new generations. Either way, I like the symbolism. It's kind of a contrivance of good writing to have that symbol that you introduce in the second act shows up in a profound way in the third act, but I thought it was just really effectively done.
So you ready to go to grades?
Yes, I'm going to give Conclave a B. Considering how upbeat I was about it, may sound a little light, but I think that ultimately, if I watch this film again, I'm not sure that there's much to really parse through. I don't think there's much for me to just continually think about. I always use this as like the crowning example, but say like a Tar.
Not every film is going to be Tar, Jeffrey.
I understand that, but the more I thought...
We're over a year after this movie.
2 years. But the more I thought about that film, the more I liked it. I think this is a film that is really, really great and really well structured and really intelligently composed in its plotting and its character developments and in its ideas when you're seeing it. But I don't think it delves as deeply into that for me to just continually be thinking about it. I'm not going to have any issue with this being Oscar nominated. I think there's a lot about it that's really, really good.
I completely agree. I really enjoyed Conclave and I give the film a B+. It's a snappy, thrilling drama that really pulled me from scene to scene with anticipation, whether it be from these soapy revelations about Cardinal's hidden secrets to the voting process itself. The film really drew me in with these reveals while simultaneously building a conversation around faith, the moral failings of the church, and ultimately this glimmer of hope in its own salvation. Thanks. Thanks for the nod. All right, and that's it for our review of Conclave. Conclave is now in theaters, so if you haven't seen it yet, go check it out. Let us know in the comments, what did you think about this film? As always, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.